for the Agile community. www.Agile.FM.
Welcome to another episode of Agile.FM. My guest today is Jurriaan Kamer, and he is out of Utrecht in the Netherlands. He is with The Ready, and he is also active under the label Agile CIO. His Twitter handle is KAJURRIA, and his website is jurriaankamer.com, and that is with a double R and a double A. Welcome to the podcast, Jurriaan.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. So you have recently, and it's a topic we want to really explore a little bit on this podcast, you have recently published an article about how to build your Spotify model, and that is getting some traction lately. There's a lot of discussions around Spotify and how they do it, and why they're so successful. And I just want to talk a little bit about, how did you come up with this topic? Because Spotify, I think we have to say that is a company you have visited a few times.
Yeah.
And you noticed a few things that's going very, very well for that company. So, so how did they pull this off? And what is your recommendation for companies out there reading through this paper?
Yeah, so indeed, I've visited Spotify multiple times over the years. First time is already 6 years ago, around 2013, 2012, I think. And so I've seen the company grow into what they currently are. And obviously, I think in 2016, Hendrik Nieberg put out there the Spotify engineering culture videos, which have been viewed millions of times, I think. So Spotify is an example for a lot of people that are looking for ways to create a structure and a way of working that scales across multiple teams. And although it's a really good example and it's a really well described example, in my article I actually argue to not copy the model one-on-one. The thing that makes Spotify unique is that they needed to cope with hypergrowth and need to have an enormous speed of innovation to be able to outpace the competitors. Mm-hmm. Because when they started at the time, they were the first company to innovate in the space of digital music subscription. It didn't exist at all, so they had no other service to copy, which means the need for rapid innovation was theirs, and that's what their whole model is based on. Mm-hmm. And I think for many other companies that's not the reality. So that's one of the points I make in the article.
Right. So there's this one aspect of Spotify that is the innovative technical innovation, business model innovation. But then on the other side, there's also a tremendous amount of competition, right? So there's several factors that put stress on that system.
Yeah, so they already knew from the get-go that they had to grow on a global scale as soon as possible to be able to outpace Google and Apple when they were going to launch their version of this service. So they knew for sure that Google and Apple would eventually launch a similar service. So they had to gain a certain size before they enter the market. Because if they enter the market, you need to have these customer base. Otherwise, you will probably not survive. Mm-hmm. And that's what they realized at the early stage. So they had to. And one of the quotes from Daniel Ek, the founder, is, "We need to innovate, experiment, and learn faster than the competition." Mm-hmm. So when you look at this organizational model and the way they're working within tech, product, and design, is that they've optimized for autonomous teams in a very radical way. So they have not optimized for consistency or for standardization. They optimized for teams that could innovate as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. And the point in my article and in what I believe in, it's a very good model for certain areas of your organization, especially if you need to be very deliberate at fast innovation. But it might not be the model or the emphasis you want to put in other places. So. Mm-hmm. You have to find your own organization design that fits the context that you are working in.
Right. You just mentioned the autonomy, right? The autonomous teams and so forth, and that is an integral part of what they're doing over there. There's also terms floating around I'm very familiar with them because I do have a history with Spotify myself, right? But there's topics around tribes, chapters, guilds,
Mm-hmm.
squads, teams. That sounds more like bureaucracy. I mean, I just want to hear from you. You when you discuss that Spotify model, what are the things that you feel like? Are there any aspects of that where you feel like, well, these are things should be very careful? Are any of these concepts where you feel like they are really good for innovation, addressing innovation and competition, or are some things that you should just leave your fingers off that topic?
Well, I mean, the squads, chapters, and tribes model is just a way of cutting up the organization in pieces that make sense. So it's about grouping together certain parts of the organization. But it's true, if you look at the level, the amount of managers versus engineers in this organization, there's a huge amount of coordination over the team. So one thing that not a lot of people know is that actually, on average, the ratio of the amount of people that are reporting to one manager, like the span of control of an average manager in most companies is like, I don't know, what do you think, about 20? When they start adding layers. Within Spotify, they actually chose to go for a ratio of 1 to 5. So whenever there's more than 5 people reporting to another manager, they add an additional layer. And that creates kind of a huge stack of management layers, and not really in the bad sense. It's just been working very well for them, because whenever they talk about this, they say that they think of their engineers as top athletes, and their people are top athletes. And in order to coach a top athlete at the highest level, the coach can only train 5 athletes at a time. To give them their full attention. So they're highly optimized for personal development, but that might not necessarily be the focus you bring in your organization.
Well, Spotify also has, and I don't know if you have an opinion about that, is emphasizing certain values. I think the wording was extending the manifesto, kind of thing. I'm not sure if that's. I would say some of those words I see there are part of the manifesto, but it's continuous improvement, iterative development, servant leadership, trust, simplicity, and so forth. Do you have an opinion about why they were emphasized, highlighted here as an extension?
Well, I think so. You're talking about the Agile a la Spotify extension of the Agile Manifesto, right?
That's right.
You can Google it, and I like it because it talks a little bit more about the behavior that is associated with what they expect from people within Spotify. So one of their things is that they make very explicit about that they expect everyone within Spotify to show up and contribute to making the best of Spotify, and that they trust people to bring ideas and bring their best work to Spotify. The other thing what they emphasize is that the way they want managers to operate in this system, which is like you say, servant leadership. The original Agile Manifesto doesn't tell you much about management and leadership. So I like how they extended the manifesto, and it's also printed across the office in different places. So it's for everyone, like, visible to see.
Very cool. I'm speaking here with Jurriaan Kamer out of the Netherlands, and we're talking about the Spotify model. And we're going to return to this conversation in just one moment. Agile is all about inspection and adaptation, and so is Agile.FM. If you like the show, please visit the show page of Agile.FM on iTunes and leave a comment rating for us. You can now also visit Agile.FM website and leave a comment about a specific individual episode online. I'm here with Jurriaan Kamer out of the Netherlands, and Jurriaan and I were talking about Spotify. We're talking about the article he wrote about how to build your own Spotify model. We talked about that this is not to be blindfoldedly copied to an organization, but there's got to be something in it that is, we could say, that is a general advice for other organizations. Might not be in such a highly competitive, maybe not in a highly technology innovative kind of environment other companies could take away from. We recently saw Joachim Sunden, who has worked with Spotify in the past, and he also always points out, do not just copy this model. But what is in there where you feel like that is something a company could literally take and says like, this is a good idea? Is there anything in there where you feel like this is a good extension for anything? It could be about scaling, could be anything.
Well, sure. I think it's important to note that the Spotify model, the way it was described by Hendrik Nieberg, I think already in 2012, it doesn't exist exactly in that way. It was a snapshot, like a photograph of a certain state that works very well in different places. And it highly emphasized autonomous teams over anything else. And I think that is a good thing. I mean, when it comes to the future of organizations, I don't believe that the hierarchical way of operating, the command and control model that it was that we inherited from the industrial age is a way of operating in the future that works. So having self-managing teams and autonomous teams that are organized around a certain mission is definitely a principle that I believe in. That is also present in the Spotify model.
Mm-hmm. Anything around scaling? I mean, there's also a lot of talking about scaling in the sense of Spotify. Is there anything? There are lots of scaling methods and frameworks and so forth out there. Anything you would say there is a takeaway from Spotify?
Yeah, so they talk. So in the Spotify model, they talk about decoupling things, right? So making sure that, and also when it comes to technical architecture, make sure that the services are decoupled as much as possible, and make sure that these teams are actually able to deliver end-to-end certain functionality. And I think that is a very good scaling model. And a lot of times when it comes to scaling is, can we actually cut it into pieces in a way that we keep this autonomy, and you don't need to manage all those dependencies. A lot of the scaling frameworks that I know actually talk about a lot of dependencies and doing a lot of big upfront planning to sync and align a lot of different teams. But I think what you really want to do is maybe descale your projects instead. Try to descale things so it actually fits in self-managing teams. Mm-hmm. So that is one of the principles I like a lot in how Spotify is organized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe we just expand a little bit on the conversation of Spotify, maybe other companies. Is there any pattern you see that those typical classic companies, which we always refer to as successful with Agile, like the Spotify, right? But also Airbnb, Facebook, and so forth, and the many others where you would say like they stand out, and many conferences you hear about these companies. Is there anything in your opinion and your experience where you feel like these are the common patterns of success when you look at those companies?
Yes, absolutely. I think, and I visited most of or actually all of the companies you just mentioned in 2013, 2014. I visited a lot of companies in Silicon Valley and studied actually how they actually work. And one of the biggest commonalities between these organizations is that they are all in kind of a continuous state of change, as opposed to a lot of the top-down agile implementations I see. They don't think of their organization as a blueprint that is updated only once every 2 years. It's an organization that is like in a continuous state of change, where change is no longer something threatening, but it's something that's a normal business as usual thing. And the other thing is that when they're shaping their change and when they're evolving their organization, they create moments of retrospection where they involve everyone in the organization. So there are some articles out there that describe a kind of whole organization retrospectives and building that into your operating rhythm. So you make sure your organization always evolves. And that's very different from what you see in traditional companies where only the few at the top have the job to think of the new model that they're going to introduce in a big bang change program only every 2 years, and then freeze the organization again, because the period of change is actually very annoying. So we want to keep the change period as short as possible. So unfreeze and freeze really quickly. While these organizations are in a state of something we call it already a continuous participatory change. We're continuously evolving and experimenting in our model.
The companies we just listed and the ones you just said like you had visited in the past, Many of them have not existed 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them are large today, such as the Spotify we just talked about, and lots of engineering personnel working for them. There's also something you just mentioned about sense and respond to over plan and predict. And the companies which we just not listed as one of those innovative companies, some of them struggle with an implementation of sense and respond. Why do you think they struggle so much, and are there any things that they can do to improve that way of becoming similar to the companies which obviously succeed very, very well with this approach?
Yeah, I think it's for a large part a big paradigm shift. I mean, if you're programmed not only in your mindset and beliefs that the future can be something that can be planned for, and you can create a perfect plan and that you can execute on, that is a big shift away from a mindset where you actually approach all these challenges as a complex problem, which inherently doesn't allow itself to be planned, and the only way to actually make sense of it is to sense and respond and iterate really quickly. It's such a big paradigm shift that it's not a surprise that companies are struggling to find a way to move into that space. And it's also because a lot of the structures and processes and practices and policies in those organizations are inherently not focused on sense and respond. So actually when you look at my background, I've been involved in agile transformations for many years, but I became increasingly kind of frustrated with the ability of agile transformations to break through that layer of the organizational operating system, which handles, for example, budgets, decision making, all the kind of the legacy structures that organizations usually won't change when they do an agile transformation, at least not in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And that's where you feel there's a kind of a ceiling or a ceiling of the organizational drag. You cannot break through if you don't really are ready to address those things as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So definitely there is this the companies out there. Let's say they plan and predict, and that's their history. And if you task them to do an agile transformation, they might follow a plan and predict approach for the transformation, right? Which is obviously contains flaws, I would say, to say the least. When people go to your website at Jurriaan.com, they might actually watch a video from you, which is listed there. I think it's a YouTube video as well, about Formula One and what we can learn from that in agile transformations. Without going into all the details of the talk you give and the video itself, but on a high level, what can we learn from Formula One? That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, true. And so as an organization designer, I'm always looking for examples of progressive organizations. And it's interesting how the sport of Formula One is an example that creates the environment for high-speed innovation in a highly regulated environment. So to give you a little bit of a taste of that, these teams, these Formula One teams, they are not small. Most Formula One teams that create only 2 cars and for 2 drivers are about 800 to 1,500 people. So these are fairly mid-sized to even large organizations. So it's not like, it's easy to draw a metaphor from a 10-people sports team. No, we're actually talking about 1,000 people that have to work together to create 2 cars. And interesting, if you look at how Formula One teams are organized, you see a lot of agile things shining through. So, for example, after the race, they spend about 2 hours together to review and learn what happened, and they go through all the steps of the race. Like, what is the strategy? How did the tires perform? How did the gearbox perform? What happened in the engine? They go through this huge checklist to kind of debrief every single step after the race. And actually, this debriefing takes longer than the actual race, and it allows them to kind of download all the insights and all the lessons they need to take into the next cycle, because Formula One races are every 2 weeks. They have this cadence, this rhythm, this operating rhythm with these learning and reflection moments built in. So that's definitely one of the agile principles at work. Wow. So that's just one example, and it's interesting that they they have this cycle of creating new innovations for their cars, for some parts of their car that actually are within 2 weeks, right? So they download the data of the race, and they immediately start working on the updated parts that they churn out in a very short time. So these cars are like, they're always in a different configuration on the circuit. They're never in the same mode, and that's pretty similar from modern day digital services, which is always evolving and always a new version.
Yeah, so a ton of sense and respond going on right there.
Oh yeah, and a very data driven culture.
Yes.
All the decisions are based on data, not on opinions. So they've learned to master their skills in that area.
Excellent. Empiricism, wonderful.
Absolutely,
yeah. Jurriaan, on your side, you are very passionate about the future of work. That is a term that stands out a few times. What do you think is the future of work? Where we're heading? It's 2018. What do you think we'll be talking about in 2020 or further out?
Yeah, it's funny how the future of work is something that I increasingly think of, that the future of work today, not in 2020. It's funny. It's always fun to brainstorm about what might be true in 2020, but it's more useful to think of how can we update our current organizational state today to something that is more future-proof, right? So that's another way to think about it. But when it comes to the future of work, yeah, I'm very interested and very active in promoting self-management within organizations. So I'm not apart from Agile. I've studied and practiced elements from holacracy and from sociocracy and from a lot of other streams of future practices like beyond budgeting and others. And they all kind of contain pieces of the puzzle, I think, to create an organizational operating system that is better fit for the future, that's moving away from this industrial age way of working and challenging all the assumptions that we've been holding over the last 100 years about how an organization should function.
Mm-hmm. How would they function? If we're saying we're going to go for self-management, let's say, do we still need managers?
Well, it depends. I think you might need some roles of coordination, but you can also trust more on the capability of self-organizing teams, right? So already you see within Agile that the role of the manager gets questioned, or at least gets deconstructed quite a bit. We've put in a servant leadership role of the product owner, and we've put a different frame around it. So I've worked with quite a lot of companies that are very far on the Agile scale, that are already thinking about, is manager the right term for our people managers, right? Should they just become coaches? Or so what you see basically breaking down is the traditional hierarchy of, I hold the power and I can make decisions that impact you, and you just have to listen to me. Mm-hmm. That is really an aspect of management that is going away, I think. Mm-hmm. And still, I mean, still you'll have different people with different levels of influence and power based on their experience and based on their seniority in the system. But these positions are not formalized into a position of power where it's just the fact that this person holding this title is now the boss of everyone, right? Mm-hmm. So you can still do that, but I think you're missing out the opportunity. If you do that, you miss out on the opportunity to involve everyone and let all the people be involved in updating and in evolving the organization to their next level. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's take this example. For example, the coordination. I like that word actually for from a management for coordinative factors. But there's this other trend going on in our industry, and that is distributed work, remote work, where teams not necessarily sit next to each other, maybe not even in an organization where quality managers, leaders, or coordinators aren't necessarily next to each other. How do you feel about the impact of remote work, distributed work, in the context of where you see the future of work?
Yeah, and that's a very good. That's great that you just asked that question, because it's just a couple of days ago that I launched an article about how GitLab makes remote work for them. Mm-hmm. So GitLab is a fast-growing company with about 300 people at the moment, and they have no headquarters. They have people, and I have to quote from my head, I think they have people in about 30 different countries distributed all across the globe that they're working together on the GitLab product. And the interesting thing about their example is that they are fully in the open. So their company handbook is open source. You can look them up in their website, and there's a kind of a written down description of how the organization functions. And that's one of the big things that they do to make sure remote work is working, is that everything is written down, and it enables an asynchronous workflow where people can just open up their laptops at whatever time they feel is useful, and they look at the tasks at hand, and they look at the responsibilities or questions that their colleagues have been asking, for example through Slack, and they just interact with that, and then whenever it's time for them to leave again, they just close their laptops. I think it can be hugely liberating if you can create a company where people don't ever need to commute to work anymore, and they can just simply decide where on the planet they can fulfill their personal needs best, and just buy a house there, sit there. As long as you have internet connectivity, you can be of use. But of course, the other side of the same coin is that we are humans and we need social interaction with each other. And although the video conferencing tools are getting better and better, we do need some real face-to-face time every once in a while. And that's why GitLab, for example, holds a summit every 9 months. They fly in everyone from all parts of the globe to one centralized place and spend a week together. To work together on the organization.
I mean, no, even the two of us, right? We met during a conference a few weeks ago in April 18 and in Munich, and it was just very easy for us to make some decisions about exactly this podcast and other things we were discussing at that point. Then doing this remotely, right? So there's something about proximity and so forth. But you're absolutely right. The video conferencing capabilities are getting better and better every year.
Yeah, and especially if you have knowledge workers that are able to autonomously do whatever they need, even if they work in a team. I mean, GitLab is a software product, so a big part of their organizations is focused on creating new software code. Or helping clients with implementations and stuff, and those are typically tasks that can easily be done remotely. So you will see more and more startups deciding to not have a head office at all and just be fully remote.
Yeah, and we can just imagine what kind of impact that would have on cities, communities, and so forth, right? So there's another wave of change coming for municipals. Jurriaan, I do want to thank you for your time and sharing some of your thoughts around the Spotify, future of work, Formula One. We touched on a few topics, sense and respond. But before we leave here, on your website on Jurriaan Kamer, and that is with a double R and a double A, there is a way of getting in touch with you and starting a dialogue with you. So whoever is interested, just click on that button and get in touch with you. And you take it from there. But it was very insightful what you have to say, and maybe some of those listeners out there might see you in keynote or present at some of the conferences and get a deeper dive into Formula One.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Joe. It was a pleasure.
Same here. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Agile.FM, the radio for the Agile community. I'm your host, Joe Krebs. If you're interested in more programming and additional podcasts, please go to www.agile.fm. Talk to you soon.